A bow staff is one of the most common and useful weapons in martial arts. Bow staves are mass-produced from pine, ash, and oak and come in a variety of colors and finishes. In this video, I'll be showing you how to carve a bow staff that's customized for your height. Here are the tools and materials we'll be using today. A block plane will be used to shape the staff, doing most of the work. 80 grit sandpaper will take off the rough edges and make it smooth. A pencil, tape measure, and ruler will be used to help me figure out where I want the bow to be tapered. A screwdriver will be used to burnish the staff. And finally, I may use some clamps to hold the wood on my table as I do my planing. I'll be working with two types of wood today. White ash is a light-colored wood of medium hardness with good wood grain characteristics. Baseball bats are typically made from ash, and they also make excellent staffs. Quarter-sawn white oak is my other choice. It's a darker-colored wood, more dense than ash, and typically your staff will be slightly heavier. Wood grain is the pattern in the wood that results from the tree's growth. In particular, we're looking for a grain pattern that is straight and as close to parallel as possible with lines closely spaced along the length of the wood. This will result in a strong and sturdy staff. Here I have two pieces of wood with very different grain characteristics. In the first one, the grain is running very parallel to the length or the width of the board. In the second one, the grain kind of meanders across the face of the board, sometimes coming straight across, sometimes going in a lengthwise direction. This staff will be very hard to break in this direction across the grain because of the grain pattern. This staff would be very likely to break along the width of the board because there is no strength in the lengthwise manner. To start, I want the wood that I've bought to be as close to square as possible so that we can get it into shape. I've bought some rough-hewn lumber, which I'm going to size myself. This piece of white ash is about 1 1/4 inches thick. I'm going to cut it so it's 1 1/4 inches wide. You could buy a dowel from a home improvement center of 8-foot length, but I question how strong and resilient a staff of that size might be. So I'm going to use my table saw to cut the wood down to size, but before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, follow, and understand all of the instructions that come with your power tools. And remember, there is no more important safety feature than to wear these, your safety glasses. I'm also a big fan of hearing protection, so I will also be wearing earmuffs. And while my shop is mostly clean, having a dust mask, or better yet, a respirator, will prevent any sawdust from getting into your lungs. So I'm just going to adjust my table saw to the correct width, and then I can be sure that both width and height are the same. Now that I have the wood cut to square, I'm going to again use the saw, knock off the corners, and approach roundness. Once I've gotten the rough edges of roughly an octagon shape, I'll use the block plane to further smooth out the corners into a round shape, aiming for about 1 inch diameter. Now that the wood is mostly round, I will be cutting the bow staff to length. Most of the time when you buy a bow from a retailer, it will be cut in 6-inch increments. 5 feet, 5.5 feet, 6 feet. But I really feel like you should have a bow staff that's about the same height as you are. Since I'm 5'8", I'll be cutting my bow at about 68 inches. Now when you buy your bow staff, it's not the same width the entire length. It usually starts thicker in the middle and then tapers the closer you get to the edge. Where do you put that taper? Well, if you hold your hands about shoulder width apart and hold the bow straight out, it closely divides the bow into thirds. So I'm going to start by putting marks where I had my hands, dividing it into thirds. So the bow will be not tapered in the middle and then taper towards both ends. To get a nice taper, I choose a distance of about 4 inches from my start mark all the way down the end of the bow. I'll show you what these do in a moment. But the idea is that I will slowly taper the bow from the first start mark all the way down to the end using the 4-inch marks as guides down the bow. I'm going to draw the pencil mark all the way around the bow at each location because I would like to taper the bow evenly around all sides. And of course I will do the same on both sides of the bow. To taper the bow, start at the pencil mark closest to the end of the bow. Using the block plane, you're going to plane down from the pencil mark to the end of the bow. Rotate the bow and try to shave it equally on all sides. As I go, the pencil marks will be removed. As you can see, I'm not using a whole lot of pressure here. I'm letting the weight of the tool do the work. When I've roughly made it past the first pencil mark, I'm going to move down to the next pencil mark and go from there to the end of the bow. Repeating the same process, turning the bow as I go, making sure that I get equal shaving on all sides. You're going to complete this process going all the way down, starting 3rd mark down, 4th mark down, 5th mark down, and for me the 6th mark down. This will be the most time-consuming and labor-intensive part of making your bow staff. Just stick with it, it'll come out great. Now that you've completed going one time down the entire length and the other side, you may notice that you've got just a very slight taper. Our goal for the finished product is for the end of the bow to be 1/2 the diameter of the middle of the bow. Since my bow is going to be 1 inch thick, I want the end to be 1/2 an inch. What this means is I'm going to have to do the same marking and shaving process several times. So I make my marks, transfer them around the circumference of the bow, take my block plane, and continue to shave. Once you have the rough tapered shape of the bow, use a piece of sandpaper curled into a tube, holding it lightly in your hand. Push and pull the bow through the sandpaper to sand off all the splinters and rough edges. Slightly turning the bow as you go. You'll do this the entire length of the bow staff. The goal of this step is not to remove a lot of material. You're simply trying to knock off any splinters and determine if there are high spots on the bow. Right here I can feel there's a spot where I need to take off a little bit more material. So I'll just go to my block plane, take it down a little bit more, and go back to feeling my way down the bow staff to see if there are any other locations. How much time you spend on this step is up to you. Your goal is to have a smoothly tapered bow from the center all the way down each end of the bow staff. The goal will be to have your bow staff balance right in the middle of the bow when you let go. That way you know that an equal amount of material has been removed from both sides, and chances are that it is a very symmetrical bow. Most bow staffs will come from the manufacturer with some sort of finish, paint, stain, or a clear polyurethane. I prefer my bow staff natural, so I will demonstrate a process called burnishing. However, if you want to stain or paint your bow, here are a few tips. For paint, make sure the bow is completely free of sawdust from sanding before painting. Use a damp cloth, wipe the bow completely of sawdust, let it dry completely, and then paint with a light coat of your favorite color. For stain, choose the stain of your choice. Wipe it onto the wood, let it sit for a few minutes according to the stain manufacturer's directions, and then wipe it off again with a clean cloth. Allow it to dry completely for several days before you finish it. For polyurethane or natural wood stain, hand rub light coats onto the bow, allowing it to dry completely. Sometimes this finish becomes slippery. I would not recommend more than one coat of polyurethane. Sand it lightly after the polyurethane is completely dry and it will be ready to use. Now that my bow is nice and smooth, I'm going to burnish it. Burnishing is the process of deforming the wood grain in order to bring that grain more visible. It has the side effect of closing the pores of the wood and giving it a shiny surface. For burnishing, I'm going to use a steel screwdriver. The rounded profile of the shaft of the screwdriver is going to allow me to get good contact with the wood and also a good grip for the handle in the end. In order to burnish it, I'm going to lightly press down on the wood and draw it towards me. I actually have used my clamps here to clamp the wood to the table so that I can commence burnishing. So I want to do a little section, then I'm going to rotate the bow and do another section. You're going to do this down the entire length of the bow until you have sealed and made shiny the entire length. As you go, it will be very noticeable as the grain begins to pop out. You want to be careful not to dig into the wood, but rather just rub the surface. You do apply some amount of pressure, but you do not want to dent the wood by pushing in too directly. Decoration of the bow is your chance to add some personalization to the weapon. I use a simple pattern on the end of the bow to indicate staffs that I have made for myself and my family. I'll be transferring the design onto my new bow with a pencil, and then I'll be using a Dremel tool to do the cutting. You could use a carving knife if you prefer. Don't forget your safety glasses. Congratulations! Your bow staff is now complete. Take it out for a test drive and see how well it works.